Good morning. Good morning and welcome back, everyone. Great to have you here for a final day of the conference. Great so many of you could make it in early after what was a pretty good night last night at the official dinner. It is a shorter day today, which does help for those who need to travel to get home and for those who want to organise other meetings in the afternoon. But while it's a short day, it's by no means short on value. We have something really special for you this morning. In what's actually a world-first international engagement, Adrian Todman, the Deputy Secretary of HUD, the US federal government's Department of Housing and Urban Development, is going to talk through the work of this important institution in the housing space and unveil the Biden administration's Housing and Climate Action Plan. This plan was presented to world leaders at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, in November in Glasgow. And I understand it's never been presented to an international audience in this way before. So here we have one of the great benefits of being able to run a hybrid conference. Deputy Secretary Todman is able to address the conference from the HUD offices in Washington, DC, and is joined here on stage by Crystal Bergman, the Senior Advisor for Climate at HUD, who has driven much of this extraordinary work. The communication technology we've all become so used to over the last couple of years is allowing conferences like the National Housing Conference to feature speakers whose schedules are such that they would never be able to get here in person. AHURI and HUD have been building a great working relationship over the last couple of years, so I'm very pleased to welcome Deputy Secretary Todman to the big screen, as well as Crystal Bergman to the stage. I want to thank the US Consulate here in Melbourne for their logistical support and willing engagement. And as I mentioned on Wednesday, we're delighted to have Consul General Kathleen Lively joining us for the conference. I also want to take a moment to thank Cindy Campbell, the Director of International and Philanthropic Affairs in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. Cindy's been instrumental in building the partnership between HUD and AHURI and assisting in our wider international outreach. And this session would not have been possible without her dedication and support. Now, the format for today's session begins with a presentation from Crystal Bergman here at the podium. Then our eyes turn to Washington, where Deputy Secretary Adrian Todman will extend on Crystal's presentation with her own observations and unique perspective. We'll then open up to Q&A, where you'll be able to put your questions to the speakers in what promises to be an inspiring session. So let's get into it. Crystal Bergman is HUD's Senior Advisor for Climate within the Office of the Secretary. She's also held a variety of senior positions at HUD, at Fannie Mae, and at the US Department of Energy, with a focus on affordable housing and green housing. So she's ideally suited to advance HUD's climate adaptation ambitions. Please welcome Crystal Bergman.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be here today. The last session of the conference is the best one to speak at, because you know you're speaking to the really dedicated, die-hard participants. But I'm very excited to be here and helping to represent the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development at this important conference. I will speak for a few minutes about HUD's climate and resilience efforts, and then I'll turn it over to Deputy Secretary Todman to give more of a bigger picture of HUD's accomplishments and goals in this administration. This has been, again, an incredible learning experience for me at this conference. I've had wonderful conversations. I'm looking forward to continuing those conversations. One of the things that I've learned, and one of the powerful traditions I've learned about while here, is the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. So I also pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past and present. In the United States, we have over 500 federally recognized tribes, Native American tribes, so I also pay respects to those First Nations as well. As I said, I've learned a lot about some of the challenges and innovations that we share in Australia and the United States, and a lot of those innovative solutions and challenges we need to work on together. One of those challenges that requires all of the innovation and creativity that we can muster is the climate crisis. A report from the United Nations just this week underscores that fact. The report tells us what many of us in this room have known for a long time, that we have not done nearly enough to either stave off the worst impacts of climate change or to protect our communities that are the most vulnerable. Climate change impacts are already here. I know you felt them here in Australia, even just this week. In the United States, We've seen unprecedented storms and disasters as well. In 2021, over 40% of Americans lived in counties that had a disaster related to climate change just last year. And of those disasters, 20 of them cost over $1 billion. So this is a crisis, both financial, health, social. And we know the world is hurtling past the 1.5-degree warming mark, but the good news is we still do have time to stave off some of the worst impacts. Every action we make and everything we do will help. The hotter it gets, the worse it gets, as we know, in terms of climate impacts. But the good news is that means the reverse is also true. The lower we can keep global temperature rise, the better it is for our communities, which means there is always an opportunity for action. There's no point in which action is useless. It just gets harder, more expensive, more painful the longer we wait. At HUD, climate is a call to action, not just because it's a global crisis that could command our attention, but because climate change impacts the people that we serve. Low-income communities suffer the worst impacts. I know you've also seen this play out in Australia as well, but low-income communities, particularly communities of color, are at greater risks of floods, storms, heat waves, and are the least able to bounce back from disasters and shocks. To give one example, United States communities that were redlined communities, so that's communities that were cut off from mortgage financing over the last several years in the middle of the last decade. Those redlined communities still today are hotter, sometimes up to 8 degrees Celsius hotter on the same day than other neighborhoods in the same city, because of lack of tree cover, lack of parks, more concrete, et cetera. That's just one of the examples of why we're seeing such a disparate impact. The Biden administration understands that this is an urgent situation, and so it's recommitted the United States to the Paris Accord and set a national goal of a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. I know those goals sound familiar to you all here in Australia. The Australian states are also working towards those ambitious but doable goals. Immediately after taking office, President Biden issued several climate-related executive orders. Those executive orders are sweeping and span international and domestic actions. I don't want to go into all the details, but I do want to bring your attention to some of the wording here, which is to say, it is the policy of my administration to organize and deploy the full capacity of its agencies to combat the climate crisis. So HUD is one of those agencies, and we take that very seriously, that commitment and that call to action. So in response to that call to action, HUD developed a comprehensive climate action plan. In keeping with that executive order, as well as the initiative to advance environmental justice and racial equity, HUD is implementing a broad approach to the climate crisis to reduce climate pollution, increase resilience to the impacts of climate change, protect public health, deliver environmental justice, all while spurring well-paying union jobs and economic growth. HUD's climate action plan has over 105 ambitious actions. They range from information and data gathering in order to make better decisions about our properties that we have, to issuing guidance, technical assistance, to also requiring better buildings in terms of green and more resilient properties. I'll touch on a few of the actions in the Climate Action Plan, but there's 105, so I encourage you to, you can look at our website, hud.gov/climate, to find even more. Please reach out to me. I would love to continue these conversations after today. I think we have a lot to learn from each other. But I will go into just a brief overview and a couple of examples. So the first objective is reducing greenhouse gas pollution. The Biden administration goal of reducing emissions by 50% by 2030 is ambitious, especially when you think about the building sector. So we know that a large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings, and 75% of the buildings that exist today will still be around in 2050. So we have a dual mandate to make sure that the new buildings we're building are the most energy efficient and resilient as possible, but also to find creative ways to address those existing buildings in ways that further the equity, health, safety of those residents in those buildings as well. HUD has a portfolio of about 4.5 million public and assisted housing units. So our role in the development and preservation of affordable housing can't be overstated in the US. According to our internal analysis, we spend about 14% of our operating budget, over $7 billion a year on utilities, and that's about 14 million metric tons of carbon, roughly the equivalent of 4 coal-fired power plants, or about 3 million cars on the road every year. So we have a financial incentive, an environmental incentive to make sure that we're improving the efficiency of those units. But we also want to make sure that that's improving the health and safety and comfort of the residents as well. So this part of the plan includes about 40 different action items intended to incentivize, encourage, or require green building. One example of an incentive is our Green Better Buildings Challenge, which we launched with the Department of Energy. Recently, we've launched a Better Climate Challenge, which is a voluntary initiative where housing developers, multifamily properties can join and pledge to reduce their carbon greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over 10 years. And then HUD supports this effort with technical assistance, support, help with planning, and connection to resources. Another program that we have is called the Green Mortgage Incentive Program. So this focuses on the financing of properties that are HUD assisted or multifamily properties that HUD insures. In exchange for reaching certain green building benchmarks, HUD will give a discount on that insurance property. It seems like a fairly small mechanism, but it's actually been incredibly impactful in terms of green financing in the United States for multifamily buildings. So since it's been launched, we've had about $46 billion in insurance for these projects and greened about 350,000 units just with that program. So we're working on, through this climate action plan, looking at how do we strengthen that, go greener, and go more resilient with that same program. I'll skip to the third pillar. The third pillar is about pursuing environmental justice and securing environmental justice. This is the heart of really everything we're doing in the climate action plan, but it also deserves its own section. Objectives here and actions in here include things like strengthening the workforce through programs like our pilot program called Building Futures, and that program connects public housing residents with pathways to green construction jobs in their areas to create sustainable, meaningful pathways to careers. This part of the climate action plan also addresses health hazards like radon and lead and increases our partnerships with other agencies around the United States that are also working on these issues. And then I'll skip back to Objective 2, increasing climate resilience. This section aims to increase resilience and adapt to climate threats. As we heard from the IPCC report earlier this week, we have a long way to go on this front. HUD invests billions of dollars every year in housing, infrastructure, and services in neighborhoods across the United States, including through its ever-increasing role in disaster relief and recovery. So over the last 30 years, we've invested over $94 billion in disaster recovery and mitigation efforts. This is arguably the largest resilience and adaptation program in the country. And our CDBG mitigation funds are really changing the way disaster funding works in the United States by putting a focus on resilience against future disasters, not just focused on building back from previous ones. So HUD's Climate Action Plan takes steps to strengthen the resilient and green aspects of HUD's disaster funding. I'm also, just to take a few minutes into a little bit of a deep dive, I'm going to talk through just a couple of examples so you can see some of the breadth that we have funded through HUD's disaster programs. In 2008, the state of Mississippi endured several major weather disasters, including severe flooding, destructive tornadoes, and heavy damage from a hurricane. In response, HUD allocated about $37 million for recovery. Much of this money was used to elevate single-family homes, like you see in the picture here. Rather than just building back in harm's way, these investments dramatically reduce the flood damage for future disasters, especially in an area like Mississippi, which from the Mississippi River to the Gulf Coast experiences repeated flooding. So this makes sure that doesn't happen, or it doesn't have the impacts again. In 2017, Hurricane Maria hit the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. Power was lost to nearly 100% of the island, creating the longest sustained blackout in American history. Households went on average 84 days without power, 64 days without water, and 41 days without cell phone service. Some homes didn't have power restored for nearly a year. Through multiple disaster funding programs, HUD has allocated billions of dollars to help the island recover. But just last month, I want to talk about this one piece in particular. HUD partnered with the U.S. Department of Energy and the government of Puerto Rico to sign an agreement to partner for the building of a resilient energy network. That energy network will develop a community-driven, locally tailored roadmap to help Puerto Rico meet its target of 100% renewable electricity. will improve power sector resiliency and increase access to more affordable energy and cleaner air. Dozens of grid modernization projects will start construction this year, and Puerto Rico's utility will sign contracts for at least 2 gigawatts of renewable energy and 1 gigawatt of energy storage projects. So that way, homes can have solar plus storage on site. So if there's a big storm, then the transmission won't be cut off from those places that have the islanding. In 2014, HUD launched the Community Development Block Grant Program National Disaster Resilience Competition. That competition awarded nearly $1 billion in funding for disaster recovery and long-term resilience to local governments with major disasters between 2011 and 2013. This was innovative because applicants participated in resilience workshops, learning a wide range of information and expertise to help their communities understand resilience, identify potential shocks that could reach the community, and importantly, learning how to meaningfully engage with their stakeholders and develop those strong relationships. Minot, North Dakota, that you see here, is one of those successful recipients. Similar to many mining towns that I've heard about in Australia, North Dakota is a fairly sparsely populated state, but recent discovery of the Bakken oil shale and ramp up of fracking has driven workers and families to this area in very large numbers, leading to a major housing supply and affordability crunch. Minot, North Dakota was able to use NDRC funds to develop a low-income program that helps families become homeowners that are in the area, but also ensuring that those homes are developed and built in areas that are not in a flood zone and that are built in a resilient way. One final example is Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana. Increasing climate impacts from hurricanes and sea level rise cause extreme land and home loss for some Louisiana coastal communities. Through funds from the National Disaster Resilience Competition, the state has been able to invest in the relocation of the Ile de Jean Charles tribal community there. That community has lost over 98% of its land since 1955, and that community, through community discussion, chose to relocate and was able to use NDRC funds to do so. What's really great about this community is that they were able to relocate to land that was still culturally significant and able to relocate as a group because that's what they chose to do. And we've seen success already. There have been additional hurricanes and additional flooding events, but those new homes built just 40 miles away have suffered just minimal damage, even those ones that were not quite yet built. So this is a really quick overview of a lot of the work that we're doing. Love to spend more time talking about individual projects, broad overview between the greenhouse gas emissions and resilience, but I want to make sure that we have time to get the full impact of the words from our Deputy Secretary, who will talk more about HUD's broader vision and work as well. So I'm looking forward to our Q&A session afterwards, and please stick around and reach out. Thanks so much.